Thank you very much for joining us this morning. My name is Chris Curry. I am the principal of the Pensions Dashboards programme, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar on how to become a pensions dashboard provider. I'm delighted to be joined by Raman Dhaliwal, Head of Product here at the Pensions Dashboard programme, and hopefully soon to be joined by Caroline Donilon, Technical Specialist on Pensions Policy at the FCA, who I think is having some technical difficulties joining us, but hopefully will be here by the time we get to that part of the webinar. Just to let everybody know that we are recording this session, and the session, including the Q&A session at the end, will be published on our website. And also, if we don't manage to get Caroline online today, we'll also make sure that the FCA slides are available as part of the website, and make sure that we arrange another session to have that conversation with the FCA as well. There'll be plenty of time for questions and answers at the end of the session, but please feel free to put your questions in the questions box that you should see on your screen as you go through the session, and we'll then try and take them in the right order as we get towards the end. But with that housekeeping out of the way, I'll move straight on to the agenda. This is what we are planning to talk to you about for the next hour or so. So I will give you a very quick overview of where we are on the programme and the update as to how much progress we've made, and a little bit about what we're planning to do in the next few months as well. I will then hand over to Raman, who will tell you a bit more about the practicalities involved in becoming a pensions dashboard provider. We'll talk a little bit about the standards and also some of the consumer protection issues that we are working through at the moment, which we think is very important and very relevant in this context to dashboard providers as well. And then hopefully hand over to Caroline for the FCA update before coming into Q&A and next steps towards the end of that hour. So just a very quick introduction, I think, as to where we are on the programme. You will see that with the timeline there, that we're currently in the develop and test phase, which started towards the back end of 2021 when we announced the award of the contract to Capgemini and Origo for the construction of the central technical architecture that we're doing, and that runs through until the end of the summer in this year, before we move into the very exciting part of voluntary onboarding and ongoing testing. So as you can see, as well as the development and integration of the architecture, which has been ongoing over this period of time, we've also done a lot of work around the regulatory framework, and we'll say a little bit more about that as we go through. As you can see, we're still in the relatively early phases of the activity plan for the programme, but actually what you'll also see is that the phases that we're going into, we actually then start to ramp through fairly quickly. So there's an awful lot going on this year, and that will continue going on through the rest of the year and into next year. And you'll see a lot more activity around pensions dashboards in the next 12 to 18 months. We're very excited about it and looking forward to it, and I hope you all are too. So we can move on to the next slide, please. Caroline, just to say a little bit about the progress for what we've been doing in the last 6 months or so. So we've done a lot of work since bringing on board our suppliers to make sure that we are working well together and that we have a common understanding of what it is that we are trying to deliver. But since then, we've actually done an awful lot of the actual development and building of the digital architecture, as well as starting some initial testing in that. And I'm delighted that we are now kind of in the test phase with a test bed operating as part of the programme, and having successfully kind of constructed an end-to-end service right the way through from the data with a provider being able to be found by an individual using a dashboard, at least in a dummy sense at the moment, before we get into the live testing later on. But progress we've been making there is significant and going very well. We also need partners to work with as part of that. So as well as working with the Money and Pension Service and the dashboard that they are constructing, we're also going to be working with 3 potential commercial dashboard providers who are going to help support the testing phase of the programme as well. Also, a very important element is the identification service that is going to be used to ensure that pension providers can be confident that the individuals who are asking for information are who they say they are. And we awarded that contract to DigIdentity towards early on in this year, and that their work has now been integrated into the digital architecture as well. So we have a very coherent and integrated service going forward. As well as the work inside the programme, there's been a lot happening outside of the programme as well. As I'm sure many of you are aware, At the end of January, the Department for Work and Pensions issued their consultation on the Pensions Dashboard regulations, and at the same time, we in the PDP published our approach to draft standards alongside that, and we'll update you a little bit more on that later on in this webinar. And we've been working very closely with those in a number of events and webinars, and going through the consultation responses to help to see how they feed into what the final regulations as they are passed through Parliament. As well as all that, it's important to us, and I think to you, to remember who's at the core of the programme, and we really are building pensions dashboards for consumers, and so we have a very strong strand of work going through looking at consumer research that we undertake to feed into every stage of the work that we're doing, and we published a qualitative research report earlier this year, but also there's an ongoing user research strand that we have, which is integral to feeding into the design of the service and the design standards and the guidance that are coming later on. And although we've started that, that's something we will continue to run right the way through the programme. If we can move on to the next slide, please. This should hopefully tell us a little bit more about what we're going to be doing. So as I mentioned, we've made a lot of progress on the build over the last few months, and we're very much now getting into the test phase of the develop and test activity that we are doing now before we get into the voluntary onboarding stage later on in the year. So the next 3 to 4 months are going to be very heavily in that testing environment and making sure that everything works properly, that everything is safe and secure, to allow it to be ready for when we can then bring external providers and live data into the system. We're going to be working hard with those volunteers to make sure that we can refine that process, both in terms of data providers and of dashboard providers, so that when we do get to the stage where we need to connect at both ends of the ecosystem, we have a process which works well, both for the architecture and for those organizations who want to join in doing that, to ensure that it runs as efficiently and as smoothly as possible. I mentioned the data standards earlier, and the other standards that the Money and Pension Service are responsible for, and we will continue to be working in that space. We are expecting to consult on the first version of those standards over the summer, and that is linked in some way to the work that the Department for Work and Pensions are doing, and they're publishing their response to the consultation of the regulations. We obviously need to wait for that response to be published in order that we have the final policy to feed into the standards that we're doing, and we then expect those regulations, once they're published, to be laid before Parliament and to become law as soon as possible after their publication. Alongside that, which hopefully Caroline will be able to tell you a little bit more later, the FCA will also be doing work publishing its policy statement and finalising the handbook rules for those regulated pension providers that fall under the FCA, which will be similar and alongside the DWP's approved regulations, and also developing the regulatory framework to qualifying pensions dashboard operators. And again, the plans are to consult on that framework later in this year, and hopefully Caroline will be able to give you an update as to what those timelines are likely to be dependent on as we get there. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, an important part of everything we do is the ongoing user testing, and we will be continuing to do that right the way through the process. And I think even once we get into live service, we'll continue to be doing that testing to make sure that we can iterate and improve it as we go through. That was a very quick and brief run through of where we are on the programme at the moment. I'm now going to hand you over to the very capable hands of Raman Dhaliwal, who will talk you through about how to become a pensions dashboard provider. Raman, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. The usual problem with being on the mute button. And good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So at the Pensions Dashboards Programme, we are busy putting together the digital architecture that will make the pensions dashboards work. We expect a range of organisations will want to become dashboard providers once the central digital architecture is fully built and tested. A separate team within the Money and Pension Service is also working on building a dashboard, which will be one of the first ones to be tested in a controlled live environment. We are keen to grow this dashboard provider market to ensure that pensions dashboards are widely available, or as widely available as possible to consumers. and that consumers have that choice to decide which dashboard services best meets their needs. The range of organizations providing dashboards could include banks, it could include the fintech industry and pension providers and even insurers. So providing a pensions dashboard, I think this is a very important point to be aware of, and I'm sure many of you are already aware of this, is that providing this service will be an FCA regulated activity. So any organization wishing to become a dashboard provider will need to meet the FCA criteria, which is due to be defined in accordance with the regulations, and Chris mentioned this earlier. And I'm hoping Caroline is able to join us to provide further information on this during this session today. In addition, these organizations will need to meet the technical conduct and design standards. We are currently working on this, and Chris will share a bit more detail on this later in the session. We don't expect this market to spring up overnight, but a wide choice of providers would create a series of benefits for both consumers and the organizations providing the dashboards. The consumer benefit is largely one of choice and convenience. Having a pensions dashboard available at an organization where an individual already has a financial relationship would allow its use to be further sort of integrated with other financial details. So just imagine looking at your pensions dashboard at the same time as checking your bank statement, for example, or looking at your savings for retirement alongside your expected pensions information. For organizations offering dashboards, the benefit comes from relationship with the customer. A bank or pension provider could extend that relationship that they already have with them, or create a new one with new customers. So a pensions dashboard could help people sort of serve or help the organization serve their existing customers better by putting them more firmly in control of their finances. It also provides an opportunity to engage with people while they're planning their retirement. Can you go to the next slide, please, Caroline? So there are three key features of the pensions dashboards ecosystem. So what do we mean when we talk about the ecosystem? The dashboard is the main interface for citizens to locate and view their pensions information. Therefore, organizations looking at becoming dashboard providers will be performing an important role in the citizen journey in finding and viewing their pensions. We then have the data providers, and these are the organizations that hold and supply that pensions information when a citizen requests it using the dashboard service. These include pension providers, schemes, trusts, integrated service providers, including the Department for Work and Pensions as a provider of state pension information. In the middle, enabling it all to happen and to take place is the central digital architecture. The central digital architecture has four components to make this whole process work in a secure and smooth manner. That's the pension finder system, the consent and authorization service, the identity verification service, and the governance register. Together, all three form the pensions dashboards ecosystem, and this will enable the dashboards to work for the citizens. Next slide, please, Caroline. Thank you. So Chris has already talked to you a little bit about the timeline. Was presented in a slightly different manner to this, but the information is still the same. So we have come along a journey to get us here to where we are today. Many of you attending today have been on this journey with us in various ways. So I can't see the slides. Has something gone wrong? Chris, can you see the slides?
No, they've gone from my screen as well, Roman.
I'm happy to talk through without the slide, but can I just check what's gone wrong?
Yeah, it's fine. Continue talking. I was just trying to join Caroline from FCA on.
Okay.
So I will fix the technical issues very shortly. But yeah, keep
No
talking.
problem.
Thank you.
It's okay, not a problem. So I'll just sort of start. Chris mentioned the program mobilization, which we did in 2019. So this phase involved the program, involved moving the program out of the Department for Work and Pensions and into the Money and Pension Service. So DWP set up a number of criteria for us to complete, including the appointment of Chris as the principal, setting up a steering group, and developing an initial setup plan. We then moved to the program setup and planning phase. So during 2020, we set up the program, which included building the team, finalizing and agreeing the architecture, setting up working groups, seeking approval to commence procurement for a supplier or suppliers for the digital architecture, and setting the first iteration of data standards. We also, during this stage, started the procurement of the organization that would build the digital architecture for us. The next stage we refer to as the develop and test phase. This started in 2021 and we're currently in that stage. So upon the completion of the procurement, we work closely with our chosen suppliers to quickly onboard them and then begin building, integrating, and testing the digital architecture. So during this time, we have continued to develop the design and service standards informed by intensive rounds of user research. We also selected organizations interested in becoming dashboard providers who would want to work with us in the early testing phase of the architecture and the service. We will now, as soon as that testing is complete, we will move into the voluntary onboarding and ongoing testing phase. So we are currently in the last few months of the technical testing. Once that is complete, we will connect the volunteer pension schemes and providers to the service using real data. It also represents a point at which the program is most reliant on other organizations' willingness to sort of work with us to participate in this before they're required by law to do so. So it is an important stage for us, and we really welcome that participation from the volunteer organizations. We will then move to the staged onboarding and the dashboard available point. So in this phase, schemes and providers will begin to be compelled to connect to the ecosystem by law. We will reach the dashboard available point during this phase. What this means is sort of agreeing a time when dashboards will be more openly available to citizens to use. Up until then, we are going to be doing very controlled testing with selected users to make sure the service is working properly. This testing will take place with real data, but when we get to the dashboard available point, it means that the dashboards will be available to people, to anyone who is interested at looking at their pensions. We do not yet have enough information to specify exactly when this will be, but we will keep everyone posted, and those of you who are going to be working with us will know how we make a decision on that stage as well. Finally, once we have reached the dashboard available point and dashboards are freely available, openly available to everyone to use, we will need to look at how we transition the program stage into business as usual. And that was the last bit of my information, Chris, and I'll pass it back to you to take everyone through the standards.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Raman. Just a reminder to everybody, if you do have any questions, to put them into the question box as we go through, and we can start to pick them up at the end. So what I'm going to do for the next couple of minutes is just give you a quick update on where we are and what we mean by standards. You'd have heard us refer to those a couple of times in the webinar already. So as you can see from the slide here, there's two different types of standards that we're looking at. So the standards and guidance that participants will implement, and these are important that they sit alongside the regulations with a little bit more detail and the practical information about how things will operate and what is going to be required to be compliant with the regulations and the standards. And then a more technical code of connection, which is more about the guidance for connecting to the ecosystem. And you can see there's a number of different standards in each of those areas. And I'll tell you a little bit about the implementation standards that participants, both pension providers and dashboard providers, will be required to meet to be part of the ecosystem, and then a little bit about the code of connection as well. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. The first standard that we will talk about, which is extremely relevant to pensions dashboards providers, are the design standards, and these are the standards that will set out the information about how dashboards can look and the sorts of information that can be on them and how they can be displayed. So we'll talk about the layouts, the content elements, what messaging and contextual information needs to be put onto dashboards and the user journeys. And the idea is that these standards will help provide a consistent positive experience for every consumer using every dashboard right the way across. Alongside that, we'll also need to have reporting standards, and the reporting standards are kind of really important to make sure that the ecosystem is running efficiently and effectively. So these will be items of data that both data and dashboard providers will have to supply to regulatory bodies that we can then use to provide a health check for the system. So this is things like analytics, benchmarking, oversight and monitoring, and critical success factors. So the normal sort of reporting things you would expect in an ecosystem of this type. There are also going to be technical standards, because obviously there will be a way to connect for both data providers and for potential pensions dashboards providers as well through the central technical, or connect to the central technical architecture, which are defining using an API and also the user managed access protocol. So those will be covered by the technical standards. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. So we also have the data usage guide. So this is of most importance, I think, to the data providers, the pension providers, which actually gives clear guidelines on exactly what the format will be of the required data items and the meaning of each data item. So that will include those which are needed for the find process, which will be used for matching individuals to their pensions, and also the view process for returning back information once a positive match has been identified. So there has been already a version of that published about nearly 18 months ago now, and an updated version as well, and a final version before coming into operation will be published over the summer for consultation. As I mentioned, alongside those implementation standards, there's also the code of connection, and this covers items such as security, service provision, and service level agreements, for example, testing, and operational standards, which all ecosystem participants will have to adhere to in order to remain part of the ecosystem. And I think it's really there again to ensure that there's to maintain that consistent high level of security, consistent operational processes, and high levels of service standards that means that consumers can experience or have a good experience as they take part in using pensions dashboards. Now, alongside the standards, we've also done a lot of work, and will continue to do a lot of work around consumer protection. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. We're looking with our partners as part of this, our delivery partners, including the pensions regulator and the FCA, around all of the potential issues that the consumers may come across when they're using pensions dashboards in the ecosystem. And what we're doing is identifying where cover and protection for consumers already exists, which is in a number of different places, but also highlighting where we have been designing integral to the system, but also working alongside with the regulations and with the regulators as well to provide additional consumer protection as we go through. I don't plan to spend a lot of time going through all of the particular issues on that slide, but I think it's worth pointing out that it is a kind of a combination of things which already exist, as well as new powers for the regulators and specific design decisions that we've made in places like the digital architecture to make sure that there is consumer protection integrated right the way through everything that we do here. Now, one of the questions that we're often asked is kind of what does that mean for both data providers and potential dashboard providers in terms of their liability? What is it that they will be responsible for as part of the ecosystem? And if we can move on to the final slide in this section, please, then. Sorry, that's gone backwards. I think we need to go forwards. That's it. Thank you. Excuse me. So we are looking at how we can help inform everybody within the ecosystem. So the pension providers, the data providers, and the potential dashboard providers around what they can rely on, what they are required to do by regulation, but also kind of where we will have to leave it to them to determine their own approaches. So we can't give any detailed advice on liability, but we can be certain in some areas. So, for example, we know that when we're looking at the identity verification and authentication of individuals, that is the responsibility of the Pensions Dashboards Programme and its successor through the running of the central digital architecture as part of that. So, if you are a pension provider or a dashboard provider and you have a secure verification of an identity from the ecosystem, then you can rely on that in order to undertake any of the transactions or the iterations that you need to do as part of that. The responsibility for that lies with the central digital architecture for doing that. Equally, we will be designing and implementing complaints handling processes and publishing consumer protection pages to help people understand what they can and can't expect and how it works, but also to make it as easy as possible for consumers to navigate their way through the ecosystem or a single point of access, so they know where they're to go if they are finding problems in using the service. There's also going to be, as we've already mentioned, published the legislation, the rules and the duties and the standards as we go through. So they will all be available as references and as a guide for what both pension providers and dashboard providers should be doing to operate as part of that. But there is a point where we can tell you what rules and regulations that need to be complied with, but we won't be able to tell you exactly how you need to operate in order to be compliant with those rules and regulations, but we will do all we can to make that information as clear and as transparent and as readily available as possible, and we will continue to update that as we go through the rest of this year. Now, at this point, I am hoping to hand over to Caroline to talk through from the FCA perspective. Is Caroline on the call? You are.
With a little
brilliant.
bit of magic, you can hear me. Yes.
We can
brilliant.
hear you. And you can probably see from my smile how relieved I am to hear you. So, Caroline, thank you very much. Over to you.
So I can genuinely say with all sincerity, I am very relieved to be on the call because it didn't look like it was going to happen there for technological reasons. So hello, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Caroline Donilon. I'm a technical specialist in our pensions policy department. And I've been involved in the Pensions Dashboard initiative for quite some time now, even stretching back to the days when this was a HMT-led initiative. Just to manage expectations about the slides that follow, for those of you who were perhaps hoping this would be a preview of our regulatory proposals, it's not that. That will follow in due course in our consultation. What this is a little bit more of a high level why and how for authorization. So particularly targeted at firms who aren't currently authorised, but there is also messages in here that are relevant for those of you who are already in our regulatory perimeter. The other thing I should mention is that you will hear me referring to qualifying pensions dashboard services here, as this is the language that's used in the legislation to distinguish dashboard providers from the Money and Pension Services own dashboard. So if you hear me referring to QPDSs or qualifying pensions dashboards, we're talking about the services that you guys are hoping to be able to develop and offer. Okay, next slide, please. Brilliant, thank you. So this is just a little bit of a potted history of how and why we're here. So during the passage of the Pension Schemes Act back in 21, which was the kind of enabling legislation for all of dashboards, government committed to making the provision of a pensions dashboard by a party other than the Money and Pension Service a regulated activity under the Financial Services and Markets Act. To introduce new regulated activities, HM Treasury has to amend what we call the Regulated Activities Order, and that's secondary legislation. So the point I want to emphasise here is for that regulated activity to be introduced, it's not something that the Department for Work and Pensions could do in their regulations on which they recently consulted. The effect of introducing a new regulated activity concerns the general prohibition. So in the UK, a person may not carry out a regulated activity or even purport to do so unless they're either an FCA authorised person or a specified exempt person. So this is what we call the general prohibition, and breaching the general prohibition is a criminal offence. So all of this wrapped up effectively means that when Treasury makes the necessary legislative change, any entity that wishes to become a qualifying pensions dashboard firm must be or become FCA authorised, and it must obtain the new regulatory permission to do so. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for the firms who are already authorised, you'll be all too familiar with this, but for those of you who have yet to enter into our perimeter, just a brief overview about the authorisation process. The purpose is to ensure that all regulated firms meet a common set of minimum standards, which we refer to as the threshold conditions. Now, our threshold conditions are set out in legislation, but we provide guidance on those in our handbook in a chapter called COND, and there's a link to that at the end of the presentation. But in summary, the threshold conditions concern some key elements. The location of offices. So the firm has to have its head office in the UK, and the meaning of this includes, but not limited to, the central management and control of the firm being present in the UK. Threshold conditions include the FCA's ability to supervise the applicant effectively. Now that might sound like a bit of an odd one, but if, for example, an applicant firm is part of a wider group, it means the FCA must be able to understand the wider group's impact on the applicant firm. Appropriate resources. So the firm must have appropriate financial and non-financial resources and systems to deliver their products and services. And this includes having the right people for the proposed business. Which brings me on to suitability to conduct the business. So your firm must have suitably qualified people and a well thought through conduct risk framework. So a clear definition of conduct risks, systems and controls for mitigating them, and risk indicators for monitoring those risks. And finally, business model. The firm's business model, its strategy for doing business, must be suitable for a person carrying on the regulated activities that the firm's seeking permission for. Now, the FCA expects firms to take regulation seriously and to plan how they will meet these standards before they apply. So at authorisation, we take a view on whether the firms meet the threshold conditions, and then under supervision, we expect firms to continue meeting the threshold conditions for as long as they're authorised. In assessing whether firms meet the threshold conditions, the FCA reviews, among other things, business plans, risk budgets, resources, systems and controls, whether the key staff have necessary qualifications, experience and ability to carry out their roles effectively. But we also consider factors that have an impact on governance and culture, which is central to improving individual accountability and conduct standards. So we use the authorisation process to test the most significant drivers of behaviour that create cultures which can lead to harm. So these include a firm's purpose, its leadership, its approach to rewarding and managing people, and its governance arrangements. Finally, firms that are granted authorization are expected to continue meeting the threshold conditions for as long as they are authorized. If they fail to do so, the FCA can take a range of actions, and these include varying or indeed cancelling their authorization. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, FCA regulation. We will, of course, in due course, consult on the full set of regulatory requirements and expectation for FCA authorised QPDS firms. Our proposals essentially will be those that we consider compatible with our strategic objective, which is to ensure that markets function well, and which advance one or more of our operational objectives. So I've listed them there: consumer protection, market integrity, and effective competition in the interest of consumers. These objectives are set for us by government. They're not ones that we pick at random. And as I'm sure you can appreciate, for us to determine what proposals are necessary and proportionate to advance these statutory objectives, we will necessarily need to take account of the wider framework for QPDSs. And so that includes the outcome of the DWP's consultation. You'll recall that that laid out the requirements that pension dashboard providers will have to comply with to gain and maintain that status of qualifying pension dashboard service. It will have to take account of the content of the MAP standards, not only how those standards will impact QPDS firms and their behaviour, but also how that will impact on the users of those dashboards. And also take account of the insights and lessons from the user testing that the Pensions Dashboard Programme is undertaking. So consequently, the timing of our consultation is interdependent on the work that's still in development and being taken forward by the Department for Work and Pensions and the Pensions Dashboard Programme. Next slide, please. Thank you. But although we've yet to consult, what I want to reassure you is that there are steps that potential QPDS applicants can take now in preparation for applying for authorisation and permission. For applicants that are not already authorised, you can begin to consider the high-level standards in the FCA handbook that apply to all FCA regulated firms. So examples of these are the principles for business. They're the fundamental obligations that firms must comply with at all times when they conduct their day-to-day business. And they underpin many more of the detailed rules and guidance in our handbook. There are 11 principles, and I've included 3 examples here. Principle 3 requires that a firm must take reasonable care to organise and control its affairs responsibly and effectively with adequate risk management systems. So this is the principle that underpins large sections of our handbook concerning systems and controls. I've pulled out 2 principles here that are specific to the treatment of customers. Principles 6 and 7. Principle 6 requires a firm to have due regard to the interest of its consumers and treat them fairly, while Principle 7 requires firms to have due regard to the information needs of its clients and to communicate information in a way that's clear, fair, and not misleading. Now, for those of you who are already authorised, you'll have seen our consumer duty consultation. That hasn't concluded yet, so I can't yet tell you the outcome of that. That would, in effect, supersede Principle 6 and 7. But I've included it here, regardless of the outcome, because what that consultation said was that if you were not compliant with Principle 6 and Principle 7, you would consequently not be compliant with the new consumer duty. So these are still relevant matters to consider. Why I highlight the principles is that a firm breaches the principles. If they breach the principles, they do become liable to disciplinary sanctions. Another example of high-level standards that apply to all firms is the General Provisions Sourcebook. And this covers the administrative duties that apply to the firms we regulate. The intention is that it makes sure that consumers are not misled, that all firms operate on a level playing field, and that firms are transparent about their regulatory status, what that affords them and what it doesn't. Now, I've posed the question here about additional permissions and whether they might be needed. And this is something that all potential applicants should begin considering now, whether they're already authorised or not. And that's essentially whether any of the facilities, services, or support that you wish to offer to your dashboard users would in fact fall within the definition of other existing regulated activities. If they do, then you'll need to have or obtain that additional permission when you apply for your QPDS permission. So for example, you might ask yourself, do I need an advice permission in order to be able to make recommendations to my QPDS users? And if you do need an additional permission, start considering now the rules that apply to those existing regulated activities and how your intended qualifying dashboard will comply with those requirements. By way of guidance, we do have a perimeter guidance manual. Again, I've got a link to that at the end of the session, and that provides guidance to help unauthorized firms identify what regulated activities their permissions need to include, but also to help authorized persons to understand the scope of their existing permissions. Next slide, please. Thank you. A note about timing. You can't apply for the new permission just yet because the amendment to the regulated activity hasn't been made, for instance. But you will be able to apply for the authorization and the permission when the gateway for authorization opens. The timing of that will be specified in our consultation. What I can tell you about timing is once that gateway is open, we aim to determine applications in a timely fashion and certainly within the statutory deadline which Parliament has given us. And that's a maximum of 6 months from the point at which a firm provides all of the information the application form asks for. If the application form is incomplete, we have a deadline of 12 months from when we receive the initial application. So inevitably, the better the quality of the application submitted, the quicker we're likely to be able to reach a decision. And so it's worth highlighting what experience of the authorization process has shown us in the past, particularly that firms and individuals don't always meet the threshold conditions when they first apply to be authorized. There are limits to what the FCA should and can do to help a firm meet the conditions, but it will provide assistance as is reasonable given its resources. Our experience also shows that some firms are just simply not ready to meet the conditions for authorization, and in these circumstances, we formally recommend a refusal of the application. Firms have the ability to withdraw their application at any time during the application process, and firms sometimes choose to do this as an opportunity to take on board feedback that they've already had during the application process, to strengthen their application, perhaps to reapply at a later date, or perhaps having considered what is required to meet the conditions, the firm may have concluded that it's no longer a viable option for them. Once authorised, if you then at a later date wish to carry on an additional regulated activity, you will need to obtain permission for that activity, and that requires a variation of permission. And similarly, if you wish to stop carrying out a regulated activity, you should also apply for a variation of permission, but in this case, it's to remove that particular activity, and that will then come off the register. If there's a change of ownership or control in the firm, then you need to submit a change in control application. But perhaps all of this is a bit further down the line from your initial application for your QPDS permission. Next slide, please. So that brings an end to this section of the webinar. As I mentioned, here are some of the links to the material I referenced earlier, which you can take away and digest at leisure. And with that, I will pass you back to Raman and Chris at the Pensions Dashboard Programme.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Caroline, for that. I'm very glad you were there to take us through that. That was incredibly helpful, I think, and very useful. And just to reassure people and to check off the first question that we've been asked, the slides, including all that useful information that Caroline has just put up in that last slide, will be available to download from our website tomorrow. So do come back if you want to relook at any of the slides, and that will be alongside the recording of this webinar as well, if there's anything which you didn't pick up or wanted to listen to again. We have had a couple of questions coming in. I think the first one, Caroline may have just answered, I think, which was asking questions about when organisations can apply and the current approval process. So I think, Caroline, unless you had anything else to add to that question, we will move on to the next one.
Fine.
Brilliant, thank you. I thought so. So the question, which I think, Raman, if you could take this one, which has come in to ask, will dashboard providers be able to use the data that they present for their own purposes, for example, marketing or financial advice?
So financial advice, yes. Marketing, no, unless the user of the dashboard gives you permission for that. Also to bear in mind that the dashboard providers themselves as organizations will not be able to see the information that the user is looking at unless the user gives that organization permission for them to see that information relating to their pensions.
Thank you very much, Rowan. So I think it's also worth mentioning that there will be a delegated access function as well of dashboards, won't there, which will allow financial advisors and those authorised to give guidance, for example, those at the Money and Pension Service, to access pension dashboards on behalf of people who have given them authorisation to do so. So I think there might be some specific issues there. And then another question, if I may, Raman, for you as well. Which says, will dashboard providers be expected to present pensions data for all dashboard users, or can they limit this to, say, only users who are already a customer with them?
That's an interesting question. So from our perspective, if you're going to be providing a dashboard service, it needs to be open to all citizens. Your customers may, or people who are already a customer of the organization may be more likely to use the service, but we are not recommending either you restrict the service to just your customers or you restrict the information the user is able to see in relation to the pensions that they can view. So all the pensions found will need to be shown to the customer who is using the dashboard.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Raman. A couple more questions coming in. One which I think Raman will hopefully be able to answer as well as we go through, which is asking about for technology partners, will there be a way for us to provide technology services such as similar to ISP services to suitably regulated entities? And if so, will there be a suitable subset of the framework to work within?
So I think what is meant, I think what's being implied in this question is that if an organization can be one that creates a dashboard, like a white label dashboard, and then passes that on to other organizations to be able to provide a dashboard service. So the quick answer is yes. I think we need to work with the FCA on this to see how that will work from the regulatory perspective. This is something that we haven't yet delved into much, unless Caroline, you're able to shed some light on that. But this is an area I think we needed to probe a little bit more on how the regulation would work for such organizations who are just sort of creating a dashboard for other organizations to become a dashboard provider.
Yes, certainly. That is something we will articulate further in our consultation, because there will be regulatory implications within that model, and parties will need to understand what their responsibilities and liabilities are within that process. So that is something to watch out for in our consultation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you, Raman, for that. Now we have had a question which I think I will try and take on, Chair's prerogative, as it were, which is talking about the ability to integrate dashboard information with information from financial institution providers, and I think some questions around how it might work in practice and potential limitations for dashboard and dashboard providers about holding data. So as Raman has explained, I think the data is not really in any meaningful sense held or can be seen by the providers. So I think what we were alluding to in that sense was the opportunity for dashboards to be alongside other forms of financial information from those providers to help the consumer in that particular way. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that what we're talking about here is that the first iteration of pensions dashboards, and there is a lot of work also going on around open finance, for example, in other areas. And I'm sure that this will be something that will develop over the longer term to allow there to be more integrated information and data services in that particular way. But that's not something that we are addressing in this initial iteration of pensions dashboards going forward. So just seeing if there are any more questions which are coming up. I mean, just while we're waiting to see if there are any more to come through, I mean, Rama and Caroline, was there anything else that you wanted to add to any of the questions or the answers you've heard already, or any other points that have struck you as you've been going through the presentations?
I think the only thing I just wanted to stress was that the information on the dashboard is personal to the individual, and it can only be viewed by anyone only if that individual gives the relevant access to those people. At this point in time, Chris mentioned delegation. The delegation that we are considering is only for qualified or sort of financial advisors which are recognized or registered with the FCA, and the guidance staff from the Money and Pension Service. So other than that, that delegated access will not be available. Now, if the user decides to note down that information and share it with someone, that is entirely up to the user, but the digital service will not have that provision other than sort of the authorized financial advisors and the Money and Pensions guidance staff.
No, makes sense. Thank you very much for reminding us of that, Ramona, and the fact that the consent and authorization is a really important part of pensions dashboards to make sure that the consumer is in control of their data and who can see and has access to that data at any one particular point, at every single point of the journey. So thank you very much for that. Just before I move on to next steps, Caroline, was there anything you wanted to add?
Just to really reiterate one of the points in the slides earlier, which is, not to think about the QPDS permission in isolation, but to think really quite carefully about, we're very conscious that dashboard providers want to be able to support their users, but they will need to think carefully about whether or not in providing that support, they are conducting something that is already considered a regulated activity. So, time invested in thinking about that now would be time well invested.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Caroline. Now, actually, I think the jeopardy of the session potentially coming to a close has sparked a number of other questions to come in, which I think we can take quickly, which will be fine. One, I think, which Raman should be able to deal with. Will all pension providers be required to provide pension data, and when would this be expected to be?
Once the legislation is in place, so DWP is currently in the process of I think the legislation is already in place. They're working on regulations, that secondary legislation that will support the primary legislation. So from April 23, data providers in a staged manner will be compelled to provide information, pension data, into the dashboards at the request of an individual. That will be a staged process. So it'll start in April 23. Up until then, we've got volunteer organizations who have volunteered to provide data into the ecosystem. But beyond that, each organization, dependent on the stage timetable, will be compelled to provide data.
Yeah, thanks for that, Roman. So I think, as you said, once the regulations are published, within that there'll be a timeline, a timetable which sets out when schemes of certain types and sizes will be expected to connect into there. But yes, all pension providers will be expected to be part of the ecosystem. A question here, I'm not quite sure whether Raman or Caroline, if you'd like to take this one. It says, will the Pensions Dashboard Programme authenticate FCA delegates of pension holders, or is that left to pension dashboard providers?
So I can start, and Caroline, if I've missed anything, you can add to that. So the ecosystem, the central digital architecture that we are building, is going to enable that authentication of the financial advisor, and we are working with the FCA to make that happen. So yes, that responsibility will sit with the central digital architecture. If we don't have a record of that individual as being a financial advisor registered with the FCA, then they will not get access to the dashboard.
Yeah, that's right, Raman. So that will be controlled through the governance register in effect, so delegation will only be possible to FCA advisors who on our register have the permissions to give investment advice or DB transfer advice, so the two relevant pension permissions. It's not to all IFAs, for example. So the governance register will control that or contain the list of who has those permissions, and the consent and authorization will then control and authenticate those delegates.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, both of you. Really helpful answer. And final question for today. In instances where a pension owner has died, will beneficiaries be given access to the data? Raman, maybe if you could help with this one.
So at this point in time, we haven't got that provision, but it is something that has been expressed as a need. We will explore this as we go into the next stage of development and see what that means. So the short answer is, at this point in time, no. In the longer term, it is something that we will consider depending on how this need is identified and reinforced.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for that, Raman. I think that just reinforces the point we were making earlier, that this is the first iteration of pensions dashboards, and things might change over time, might be improved, might be more functionality. I think the challenge there is the way that this currently works with the digital identity verification and authentication. And actually the identification of beneficiaries is a further step removed from that, and makes it quite difficult to make sure that you get that security element as part of that work. But it's something that we can see there might well be a need for this in the future, so it's something that's very much in our plans to consider. What a great set of questions and some really good answers. Thanks very much, Raman and Caroline, for that. If we could just move on to the next slide, please, and we'll talk about the next steps. So as we mentioned, we spent a bit of time talking about the standards that are going to be running alongside the regulations to help pension providers and pensions dashboard providers with the practicalities of being part of the ecosystem. And we'll publish the proposed set of standards for public consultation in the summer, and we'll run that over the summer for 6 weeks to allow hopefully enough time for good consideration and feedback from all the relevant stakeholders that we would like to hear from. We're not just going to leave you with something to read and some questions to answer. We will be running a series of explanatory webinars and also speak to some of you face to face if you would like to do that, in order to make sure that we can take on board your feedback and your thoughts into the final set of standards. And also, we mentioned we're doing a lot of testing, some of which has already started internally within the programme, but shortly to begin with our alpha data and dashboard participants over the summer. And we'll be making sure that any learnings that we find from there will be being shared throughout the industry, to try and make sure that the best practice and the tips and hints that we learn using the volunteer providers and participants as we go forward can be shared amongst the industry before things become mandatory rather than voluntary, and to again improve the efficiency and the smooth running and operation of onboarding and many other areas as part of the ecosystem. So it's now 12 o'clock. It just remains for me to draw this webinar to a close. I'd like to say thank you very much to Raman and to Caroline for their contributions to really good presentations and for answering all the difficult questions, so I didn't have to. Thank you all very much for your interest in becoming excuse me, qualifying pension dashboard providers, and for your time today listening to us and sending in your questions, which were incredibly illuminating as well. If you would like to get in touch with us, the details are on the screen. Please do keep in touch. Probably the best way is to sign up to our newsletter, and you will then automatically get information about what you might need to know and what's coming up, and also further contact details as well. But thank you very much for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of your week. Thank you.